Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 33D, an interview on Harry Truman, Isaac Woodard, and civil rights. I'm excited to welcome Judge Richard M. Gergel to the show today. Judge Gergel is a district judge in South Carolina, and more relevant to this conversation, he is the author of Unexampled Courage, The Blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard and the Awakening of President Harry S. Truman and Judge J. Waitis Waring. And this is the topic we're going to talk about today. Thank you for joining me today.
Delighted to be here.
So let's start with, who was Sergeant Isaac Woodard?
Sergeant Woodard was a native of South Carolina. He entered, like millions of young men in the United States Armed Forces at the outset of World War II. He served 3 years. He served with distinction. He obtained multiple promotions ultimately to a sergeant. He was battlefield decorated. He was honorably discharged. And on the day he was discharged, en route home while still in his uniform, he had a dispute with a white bus driver who was extremely disrespectful to him. And the bus driver, I can get into the details of this, but ultimately at the next stop went looking for a local police officer to have the sergeant removed from the bus. He's about 40 miles from his home at this point after 3 years of military service. And the police officer took him into custody and beat him repeatedly, eventually blinding him. And it became a story of tremendous notoriety, first in the African American press, and eventually to the general public. And it became a subject of a series of broadcasts by Orson Welles on his nationwide radio program. And eventually a group of civil rights leaders brought it to the personal attention of President Truman, who was outraged of the idea that a battlefield decorated soldier on the day he returned to the United States was beaten and blinded. And he initiated a series of actions which led to what really was a rather unprecedented event in 1946, the prosecution by the United States Department of Justice of a white police officer for the beating of excessive force against a black citizen. And he was prosecuted in South Carolina, and the case was tried before United States District Judge J. Waitis Waring, who was a Charleston patrician. Father was a Confederate veteran. Multiple generations of his family were slaveholders. He was probably the last person in the world that you would think would be particularly moved by these circumstances. But in fact, he presided over a trial. The officer was obviously culpable, but an all-white, all-male jury acquitted the police officer in 28 minutes. And Judge Waring was really alarmed and traumatized himself by the injustice of this event. And it sent him on a personal journey of introspection and study. And he thereafter filed over the ensuing years, a series of landmark civil rights decisions, unprecedented in his day from a Deep South judge.
And so let's go back toward the start of this and dive deeper on some of these parts.
There's a lot
there. There's a lot to unpack.
Because I haven't gotten into the President Truman's role.
Absolutely, and we will get to President Truman for sure. So going back to the start, Isaac Woodard, he's leaving the military because the war's over. He's still in his uniform.
He's honorably discharged, going home.
Right.
He's one of 900,000 African Americans going home at the end of World War II.
And then he gets beaten by this police officer, blinded. And if I remember right, the next day, the day after this happens, he gets taken before a judge. And you might be thinking, oh, great, a judge. Here's a chance for this wrong to be addressed. What happened instead?
Well, he had prosecuted for public drunkenness. He was not drunk. He was not disorderly. I think it was disorderly conduct and public drunkenness. He wasn't either. But he was prosecuted, and then he was fined $50. And the problem was he didn't have $50 in cash on him. He had a check from the military for about $650, but he couldn't cash it because he was now blind. Mm-hmm. He couldn't see. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, how much you got on you? and they gave him 40. He had $44. They took his money and told him he could leave, but they had a problem. This man was blind; he couldn't see.
Right.
He
Right.
was, and he had just been beaten so badly that he, almost certainly had brain injury and
Yeah.
brain trauma. And they took him. Eventually, they realized they had a problem. This guy was like completely immobilized, and they took him over to the VA hospital and left him on the doorstep.
Oh my God.
And the story, sort of an African American orderly there who was a member of the NAACP reported to one person, to another person, and before long, a memorandum had gone to the NAACP's national office in New York, reporting the details of this pretty terrible event.
And how unique was this? Is it? You mentioned 900,000.
I gotta say, there are parts that are unique. Obviously,
Right.
the engagement of the President of the United States,
Sure, of course. Yeah, later.
is very unusual. But there were a lot of very ugly events as these African American soldiers who had fought for American liberty and returned home to Jim Crow. And many of them were not prepared to acquiesce to these racial customs anymore. They had fought for their country. They expected better. They would later become the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement, these Army veterans. Mm-hmm. But Isaac Woodard is distinctive because he's like the first guy out.
And so that's how he became the face of this.
He became the face because he's literally comes home and he's like beaten literally before he gets home.
Yeah.
And there are other episodes in other parts of the country. I detail those in my book. But this one really stood out. And there was something just terrible about these circumstances. And, every time I've given a lot of talks on this book. And when I describe how he's blinded, there's like this groan in the audience because he's on the ground and the officer, he's almost like essentially unconscious, and he stabs Woodard in both eyes with his blackjack.
Yeah.
And that is one of the factors that President Truman really notices and which he writes his attorney general about when he hears about it, that the officer had intentionally put out Woodard's eyes. And what was his crime? Let me tell you what his crime was.
Yeah.
He went to the bus driver. He's on a Greyhound bus. They don't have bathrooms at the time.
Right.
And he says to the bus driver, at the next stop, can I step off, please? And the bus driver apparently took offense that a black man would ask for such an accommodation. Although the Greyhound policy was they were supposed to accommodate such requests. Mm-hmm. And he curses the guy. He curses the Woodard, and he says, go back to the back of the back of the bus. And Woodard curses him back, very big surprise, and says, speak to me like I'm a man. I am a man just like you.
Yeah.
That's his crime. And for that, and when he's arrested, he's befuddled. He's all I wanted to do was go to the bathroom. I mean, it's
right.
And, and he's like hit over the head. There are eyewitnesses to this on the bus who immediately, when he starts being questioned, he tries to explain himself, and the officer pulls out a billy club and hits him over the head. I mean, it's just, it's a horrific set of events. It captures a very tragic period of American history. Yeah. Before World War II, there were like in the 40 years before World War II, there were like 2,000 lynchings in America.
Wow.
It is incredible. There are like total about 4,000 lynchings in American history. Most of them are black men. There are some white people, some Hispanics, some Indians, some women, a few women, not many. But, these soldiers were returning home and they expected better because they had fought for American liberty.
Absolutely. And tell me more about how Woodard's story kind of became the main one, and what was the national reaction to it? You mentioned Orson Welles plays a role. You mentioned there's a memo to the top of the NAACP. But I'm also curious, like in the North, is that where you really found the sympathy? In the South, was anybody horrified by this, or are they just like
African Americans were? It is a kind of interesting story. I mentioned to you the African American orderly tells
Right.
a local NAACP leader in Columbia, South Carolina. That leader asked the black newspaper editor to go out and interview Woodard at the hospital, which he does. John McCrae, he's like completely stunned by this. He has national NAACP connections, and he sends a memo to Walter White, then the executive secretary of the NAACP, the most important black civil rights leader in America. It lands on his desk in New York. And this is the guy he is the boss of Thurgood Marshall. I mean, he's like a very important guy and a very close personal friend of Harry Truman's. That's how he's the one who tells Truman the story.
So, tell me, how does it? Like, what's this moment of the story reaching Truman? And you told me Truman's horrified. Is that his initial reaction?
Truman is, there's a group of civil rights leaders who are to meet with Truman September 1946. To talk about these episodes of racial violence against black soldiers. Woodard wasn't the only one.
Yeah.
And this group is trying to encourage President Truman to call Congress back into special session to adopt legislation against racial violence against soldiers and against lynching. Well, it may be hard for people to believe today, but the issue of a proposal to adopt a federal statute prohibiting lynching, a federal statute, had been debated since about 1918 and had been defeated every year.
Yeah.
And Truman had been in these battles. He had voted to break the filibusters to pass such a law as a senator, and he knew that wasn't going to happen. I mean, that was a waste of time to bring Congress back. And he's trying to balance some political considerations here. Among them, the most loyal bloc of voters for Democrats at the time were Southerners, white Southerners. Black Southerners weren't allowed to vote. And they were part of the New Deal coalition, very important. Didn't want to alienate them. But now you have so many African Americans during World War II and afterwards who had migrated north, the Great Migration. And they were in cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and they voted. They were registered to vote, and they voted. And they were an important voting bloc. So here you have this tension inherent. Somebody called it, an unhappy alliance between white Southerners and black urbanites. And Truman is trying to walk that fine line not to alienate his supporters while doing something he thought was right. And even told by his staff, don't get in the middle of this thing. You're going to, this is a road to nowhere. But so they're sitting there talking about this, he's calling Congress back, and Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, is listening. He's not saying much. These other civil rights leaders are pushing Truman. And it's clear to Walter White that Truman does not appreciate the gravity of the situation. So he stops the discussion and says, Mr. President, I want to tell you the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard. He then recounts the story. And there are multiple accounts of this. Truman's face turns red. His jaw is locked. He is extremely upset. And as a result of this, he writes a letter the next day to his attorney general. And he says, I need to tell you about an incident we need to act on. That is code word prosecute. Because they aren't prosecuting anybody right now. Yeah. And then he says, we got to do more than just prosecute. And he said, I'm going to appoint the first presidential commission on civil rights. And he does that. This letter prompts those two things. It's got the Isaac Woodard blinding and then the presidential commission.
I'm struck by this reaction from Truman because he didn't exactly grow up in a cradle of civil rights, in Missouri.
He clearly did not, but he had a very progressive voting record on civil rights. And his mother thought John Wilkes Booth was a hero. Woo. She would not sleep in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House. I mean, this is his background, okay?
Right.
He's from southern Missouri. His grandparents on both sides were slaveholders. Yeah. So, like Judge Waring, he is an unlikely candidate for this role.
Right.
But he he had commanded troops in World War One, a battery in World War One. He and as commander in chief, he deeply respected soldiers, infantrymen, men on the front lines. Isaac Woodard had unloaded ships on beaches. That's how he got his battlefield decoration. Very, you can imagine how dangerous that was, unloading landings. He did.
Yeah.
That's what he did. He was a sergeant in charge of a group that did that.
Yeah.
And so he is deeply disturbed. And what is so interesting about Truman is that from that day on, when anyone would ever discuss with him civil rights, he would tell them the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard.
Wow.
He told it. There are multiple accounts of this.
Yeah.
In 1948, Truman is running for re-election. You remember that's the race with four candidates. There's the Republican, there's the Dixiecrat, and then there's the whatever Henry Wallace was. So he's got people on the left, the right, everywhere. They're all after Harry Truman. He is, people, are assuming Dewey is going to win. And in the middle of all this, Truman's Civil Rights Committee issues this report with a blueprint for addressing Jim Crow, dealing with voter disenfranchisement, dealing with race discrimination in housing, and discrimination in employment, etc. Harry Truman endorses publicly the entire report. And one of the proposals was the desegregation of the armed forces of the United States. It had been segregated. The armed military was segregated. And Harry Truman couldn't get Congress to do anything. Southern congressmen had all the seniority. They locked up Congress. They filibustered when they couldn't get their way. But Harry Truman was the commander-in-chief. And in July of 1948, he orders the desegregation of the armed forces of the United States. It is a stunning, stunning decision. There was no desegregated institution in American life at the time. The most admired institution in America was the military. Obviously, it's a couple of years after World War II.
Yeah, you just won the war. Everybody's been in it.
War. And here he is. And by the time Harry Truman leaves office, 95% of American troops are in desegregated units.
Wow.
And that was not easy either. So he's running he's got this impossible situation with four candidates in the race.
Right.
He's attacked from the left and the right. The Dixiecrats are going to mess him up in the South, his most loyal base. And in the middle of this, he desegregates the armed forces of the United States. And a friend from Missouri writes him a letter and then says, Harry, you're going to lose this election if you don't get off this civil rights thing. And Truman writes him a letter back. This is to his friend. He tells the Truman Library not to release it until after his death. Okay, so he's like not trying to get credit for this. Yeah. And he says to his friend, Dear Ernie, you don't know things I know. He tells him the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard and says, if I lose the election over this issue, it will have been for a good cause. He didn't back down.
That's incredible. Sticking on Truman a bit longer, and we will get back to Woodard. Do you have a sense of where civil rights was on his list of priorities as president before he learned about Woodard and after?
Before, they were trying to do everything possible to avoid putting their hand on the hottest spot of the oven, right? I mean, this was not what his staff wanted him to do. And it was fraught with peril, right? Political peril. But once he was in, he was all in.
Yeah.
And that is a remarkable part of the story. So in addition to desegregating the armed forces of the United States, one of the most significant acts of the post-World War II period, he agrees to deliver a talk to the national meeting of the NAACP in Washington.
Right.
At the foot of the Washington Monument. It is, I mean, Lincoln Memorial. It is a
Right.
stunning speech, because he basically declares a new agenda for Americans' government, not to be protected from the government, but to be protected by the government. Civil
Mm.
rights.
You talked about some of the reaction this got. We now had a Dixiecrat candidate in 48. You had his friend in Missouri, Ernie, telling him to get off this. What impact did this have on Southern support for Truman and the Democratic Party going forward?
Well, people, thought it was the end, right? That the white Democrats would all vote for the Dixiecrat. Well, in the end, Harry Truman carried 8 of the 12 Southern states, and he carried every county in Texas.
Wow. I'm from Texas, so wow.
He carried every county in Texas. Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, said
Yeah.
a Dixiecrat was as welcome at a family bar as welcome as a Democratic meeting as a bastard at a family reunion.
Ooh. Good Sam Rayburn quote. But after that, because we know these parties do eventually switch, is this a factor in that eventual kind of switching of allegiance of Southerners?
Not really. It really occurs, a little more in the 1970, in the race, 72 race, Nixon race is the stronger one. There was some movement then. Obviously, the candidacy of General Eisenhower was a very big
Right.
factor everywhere.
Yeah.
Because he was such a hero to American veterans. But it didn't happen all at one time. But the biggest move was the Nixon McGovern race. Remember, Jimmy Carter was elected with Southern support as well. So it's not really over, I guess, when you think about it, really until the Reagan race. Where it really consolidates completely because Jimmy Carter wins, and
Right.
Of course, in the last election, the Democrat Biden carried Virginia and Georgia.
Going back to Woodard part of the story now. You mentioned one of the things Truman did is he told his attorney general, you need to prosecute this case. What happens next on the case's front then? What happens when this case goes back to trial? And is there any journey of it getting there?
Yeah, the FBI opposed the prosecution. They sympathized with the white police officer. They were actively undermining the case. The local U.S. attorney, who was allied with the local politicians, was opposed to it, and they had to bring a guy from Washington to prosecute the case. They were completely unprepared. The FBI's investigation was completely it was very incomplete, which ended up being a factor at trial. They had never gotten the medical records, for instance. It was a really slipshod prosecution. I discussed that extensively in the book. But Judge Waring would later say, it was really a travesty the way it was prosecuted, but it didn't matter because they had all they didn't call some eyewitnesses and stuff. He says they could have had 10 eyewitnesses and they would have still acquitted the guy.
And to tie this back to Truman again, when he hears, you mentioned earlier, 28 minutes, an all-white jury acquits this guy. Does Truman have any reaction to that?
I don't have any report specifically about that, but that's a bad day. That acquittal is the same day that the Democrats lose control of Congress for the first time since 1930.
Yeah, got it. So he had other things on his mind.
Bad day.
Yeah.
But let me say this, he didn't flinch because he then appointed the Presidential Commission on Civil Rights after that.
So Woodard, he gets his day in court, but it's a sham of a trial. It's acquitted in 30 minutes less. What's next for Woodard? How does he carry forward in his life?
Yeah, of course he's blind, which is one heck of a disability. He for a while he's kind of a celebrity. I mean, this is a very well-known case, and he goes around the country giving talks. NAACP arranges speaking engagements all across the United States to packed audiences in multiple cities. But after a while, the story fades, and he struggles. And initially the military would not give him disability, claiming he had already been discharged from the military when he was beaten and blinded, though he was still in his uniform.
Right.
Later, by order, he had to go home in his uniform. Congress would later change that. Later changed that that law, and now you the soldier is considered in service until he arrives home. Um,
Mm.
it but it was about a decade before Woodard actually achieved his disability, obtained his disability, and then he lived a fairly middle class life. I mean, he was able to buy a home. He had military benefits, etc.
Mm.
But he had a lot of hard years before then,
Sure.
and he always struggled, of course, with his disability. He worked for a
Sure.
while running a newsstand. You know how you've seen blind people run
Sure.
newsstands. He did that. Um, he, uh, once he obtained the disability, he was able to buy some rental property. He actually was a pretty
Mm.
shrewd guy. And he died in his early 70s. There was an article in Jet magazine about 5 years after this incident called Isaac Woodard, the America's Forgotten Man. I mean, he
Mm.
was lost to history. And here's a kind of tragedy. He had this huge impact.
Yeah.
Harry Truman and Judge Waring,
Yeah.
who both, I haven't gotten to Judge Waring.
Yeah, I got a question for you on Judge Waring coming up.
And he never knew the impact that he had. So he died without knowledge. Now he certainly had a period of celebrity. There's an event in New York, a benefit concert for him, in
Mm.
which the
Mm.
uh, one of the co-chairs was Joe Louis, then the reigning heavyweight champion of the world. And I have a picture in my book of him with Joe Louis. And 20,000 people came to the benefit concert. Cab
Wow.
Calloway, Woody Guthrie,
Yeah.
Nat King Cole, et cetera, performed. And out of that, they bought him a house. Yeah, the
Wow.
fund money raised bought a house for him.
Do we know what became of the sheriff who blinded him? He was acquitted after that. Does he disappear into history, or is there ever another attempt at justice there?
He suffers no adverse consequences, and no one seemed to remember it ever happened. When I began talking to folks in Batesburg, South Carolina, where this occurred, no one knew that their former police chief had been prosecuted in a federal court, and they remembered him. He lived into his 90s as this nice usher at the Methodist Church. I mean, nobody was. They were
Oh my gosh!
stunned to hear this man had so viciously beaten a returning soldier that he blinded him.
Wow, wow. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but was expecting that. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about Judge Waring, who you've mentioned several times. Tell me more about how this impacts him, what happened in his courtroom, and then what influence he has, what role he plays in civil rights.
Well, Judge Waring had been skeptical about the federal government prosecuting a local police officer. It wasn't really done at the time, and he was kind of miffed a little bit. Why would the government would be doing that? But once he heard the testimony of Woodard on the stand, he knew it was true. He knew it was true. And when the jury did not hold the officer accountable, it really deeply distressed him. He had always operated on the assumption and understanding that he was administering a just system. And
Mm.
this was really an indication he was not. And his wife, the trial was in Columbia. He lived in Charleston, and she had traveled with him to Columbia and sat in the courtroom during the trial. And she was horrified. And when the jury announced the acquittal, few noticed that Mrs. Waring left the back of the courtroom in tears. And she had never really been engaged in this issue as well. But they got back to Charleston, and they never saw the world the same again.
Yeah.
And they couldn't talk about race. in Charleston in 1948, 46, 47, 48. There was no space in that era to talk about race in the white community. And the Warings began their own private study, self-study, reading books together. She would read out loud to him at night a chapter from a then cutting-edge book on race and justice in America. There were a number coming out of after World War II. And they were sort of privately, coming to become very sensitive on this issue of racial injustice. And about 6 or 7 months after they're kind of engaged in this self-study, he gets assigned a major civil rights case as a federal judge involving the so-called white primary. African Americans were prohibited to vote in the Democratic primary, the only election that mattered in the South at the time. And Judge Waring ordered, he told his wife, he said, if I rule for the plaintiff in this case, our lives will never be the same. Mm-hmm. Boy, was he right about that. He issued an order saying it is time for South Carolina to adopt the American way of conducting elections. It is time for South Carolina to rejoin the Union. And boy, that hot. And then a series of policies were adopted by the Democratic Party to avoid his order. He then summoned the entire 87 members of the Democratic Party Executive Committee to his courtroom in an emergency hearing and told them that if someone violates an order of a federal judge, there can be a fine or a jail sentence. I want you to know if you violate my order again, there'll be no fines.
Ooh, wow.
Soon after, they burn a cross in his yard. He required 24-hour security.
Wow.
He had constant death threats.
Yeah.
The Time magazine said Waring was the man they loved to hate, but they said he was proving to be a man of cool courage. So while he's being vilified by all these elected officials in South Carolina, there are efforts to impeach him, which go nowhere, and in Congress, and he continues to study the issue of race and justice, and he becomes convinced that the granddaddy of all of Jim Crow, Plessy v. Ferguson, was legally, morally, and historically wrong. And he orchestrates, I can get into the details, but he orchestrates a trial in front of him in which he wrote, it was a 3-judge panel. It's a little bit of an involved story, but he's on one of 3 judges on the first of the 4 cases that make up Brown versus Board of Education. And he writes a dissent in which he says, everyone's on a fool's errand trying to prove something is equal or not equal. Segregation is per se inequality. That language shows up again in Brown versus Board.
So he ends up playing a huge role.
He's the father of Brown.
Yeah, that is wild.
On the night of the Brown decision, the leadership of the NAACP went to Judge Waring's apartment. He had since moved to New York City. He was so ostracized in Charleston in his retirement. Okay. And they go to his apartment, and the leadership toast him as the father of Brown.
Wow.
And what sent him on that journey? Watching the presiding over the trial of the blinding of Isaac Woodard.
And is that ultimately what the legacy is of this episode? Is the legacy of what happened to Isaac Woodard and Truman's response and his actions and the impact on Waring? Is it Brown v. Board, or is there a bigger legacy?
Well, there are the two major. If you had to say what were the 2 most significant events in the post-World War II era, that sent the civil rights movement on its journey, it was the desegregation of the armed forces of the United States and Brown versus Board of Education, both which were influenced heavily by the blinding of Isaac Woodard. He prompts Truman to desegregate the military, and he prompts Judge Waring to write the great dissent that becomes Brown versus Board.
If you've enjoyed this interview with Judge Gergel and want to learn more about Woodard and Truman and Waring, you can find Unexampled Courage, The Blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard and the Awakening of President Harry S. Truman and Judge J. Waitis Waring at a bookstore near you. Thank you for your time, Judge.
Good. Be safe, and thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also follow the show on Twitter at 8phpodcast or on Threads, kenny.ryan27. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, I like Ike, you like Ike, we all like Ike. But why? Let's dive in on the president who rose from poverty to lead the Allied armies of World War II in Europe and preside over an escalating Cold War abroad and an escalating civil rights movement at home. Dwight Eisenhower is up next on Abridged Presidential Histories.